Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, employment law in Ireland is changing at an unparalleled level, sometimes making it difficult to keep up with the latest developments. Nichola Harkin is Head of Employment Law Services with Ibec, and she joins us now to tell us about upcoming changes to auto-enrolment pensions, pay transparency, and a recent Supreme Court decision about the classification of independent contractors as employees. But Nichola, you might start by providing us with an overview of your role with Ibec.
Thanks, Karl. Well, I'm the Head of Employment Law Services in Ibec, so I work within the wider Employer Relations Division. And I suppose what I mainly do is, first of all, help and advise employers on keeping compliant with employment laws. And second of all, lobbying and influencing on behalf of employers in relation to employment law changes in the workplace. So it's a busy job, but mainly spent helping businesses stay compliant and stay up to date with employment law, which, as you say, is ever-changing.
And what topics are you currently lobbying on behalf of your members at Ibec?
Well, what we're really focused on at the moment, I suppose, is the upcoming transposition of the Pay Transparency Directive, which needs to be transposed by next year, and also around the upcoming auto-enrolment, which is coming in a little bit sooner and looks like it will take effect from September of this year. So I'd say at the moment, they are probably two of our top priorities.
So what exactly are you calling for regarding those two introductions?
Well, the main thing we're calling for on the Pay Transparency Directive, as I said, that has to be transposed by June 2026. And our fear, or my fear, would be that some people might not fully understand the level of work that is involved for employers in preparing for that piece of legislation. So really importantly, we need that legislation transposed on time and giving employers adequate time to get ready for its implementation. It's not really enough that I think for employers to be told, oh, you know it's coming, because when you don't know the detail of what's coming, it's very difficult to actually prepare for its introduction. So we really will be calling on the government to ensure that that directive is transposed on time and that employers are given adequate time to get to grips with the new rules and to prepare for compliance with them. And then I suppose on the auto-enrolment, again, we're looking for adequate time for employers to really be prepared for this. I think employers across Ireland are generally very supportive of the introduction of auto-enrolment. We certainly see the merit of auto-enrolment, but it's really important now that when it is introduced, that it's done right, and that the software for the system, that the nurses who are running it, and that My Future Fund is really ready and prepared, and that we have as few hiccups as possible once it is introduced. And that might take maybe a little bit more time than September of this year, but the focus and we think the priority should be on doing it right.
And of course, over the past few years, employers have been faced with the introduction of statutory sick pay, increases to the minimum wage, as well as increases to leave entitlements in some circumstances. How have Ibec's members reacted to this raft of changes that have come in?
I mean, a lot of our members have found it very challenging. And I suppose really where the challenge has been is around the quick succession that so many of these changes, like you say, came into effect. A lot of the changes in of themselves have merit, and it's not so much that organisations or our Ibec members had a particular issue with any one of the changes, but it was really the uncoordinated nature of their introduction that businesses found really challenging. And the very sharp increase in labour costs that they resulted in within businesses. So that really, I think, has been where the challenge has been for members. We were happy to see in the Programme for Government, I suppose recently enough published, a greater focus on cost competitiveness. And we would be hopeful that there is more of a focus on competitiveness now from this government, and we will hope to see that in action over the next couple of years.
Now, you mentioned earlier about auto-enrolment pensions and their introductions from September, and of course Ibec calling on government to make sure they're ready and that everything is in place for employers in that respect. But what can employers themselves do to prepare themselves for this introduction?
Well, I suppose there's probably two main actions that employers should take. The first would be for employers who don't currently have occupational pension schemes in place. For them, the introduction of auto-enrolment will really have a budgetary impact, because it will mean that they will be contributing 1.5% for impacted employees and relevant employees for auto-enrolment. And also they'll need to prepare their own employees to see deductions being made from their pay slips for pension contributions as well. So for organisations who don't have an occupational pension scheme, it's really the cost impact and preparing their employees for this change. And then for organisations who do have occupational pension schemes in place, they might think, oh, well, this doesn't impact us at all. We already have our own occupational pension scheme in place. But it might actually have an impact, because the key to auto-enrolment is it'll impact any employee between the ages of 23 and 60 who earn €20,000 or more and who are not showing up any pension contribution on their pay slip. So an organisation might have an occupational pension scheme in place, but for whatever reason, certain employees might have opted out of that pension scheme, or you might have a service requirement. A 6-month service requirement to join a company pension scheme wouldn't be unusual. So with auto-enrolment applying from day one, even those organisations who do have existing occupational pension schemes do need to look at auto-enrolment and assess what they need to do to prepare. And I'd probably say for those organisations, the first step would be a gap analysis of how many individuals in their employment are currently contributing to a pension scheme and how many fall out of that, and then determine whether they want to bring that outlying cohort into the occupational pension scheme, or are they happy to just be gathered up by auto-enrolment.
And as you mentioned earlier, a new directive from the EU is expected in June 2026, which will impose gender pay reporting obligations on businesses of all sizes. But what are the likely obligations going to be for employers in that respect?
Yes, exactly, Karl. You might be wondering, why are we worrying about a piece of legislation that's not coming in for over a year? But as I mentioned earlier, it really will have an impact across the board, and there's a huge amount of preparatory work for organisations to do. So you mentioned the gender pay gap reporting piece, and we know that will apply already. It will apply anyway in Ireland this year to organisations with 50 employees or more. So that will continue to be the case with the Pay Transparency Directive. But there will be other obligations in the Pay Transparency Directive that will apply across the board to all employers. And really, I think probably one of the biggest impacts that businesses need to prepare themselves for is really an opening up of conversations around salary. So I think at the moment, businesses really view salary and pay levels as very sensitive, private information that's not discussed widely within the organisation. But once the Pay Transparency Directive comes into play, employees will have more rights to request information around average pay levels within an organisation. Now, that doesn't mean that employees can ask the HR department, what is, so-and-so sitting beside me earning. They won't be able to get that level of detail, but they will be able to ask for average pay levels within categories of work. So there's a bit of a cultural shift, I think, that needs to happen within a lot of businesses to be prepared for that change. And then again, we come back to the gap analysis and the data gathering. And I would encourage businesses just to look at how easy is it for them to gather the data around pay levels within the organisation and the work within the organisation, and what might constitute what we call work of equal value. So it's again an information gathering exercise at this early stage, so that companies are in as good a position as possible for when the rules come into force in June 2026.
And Nichola, there's also an expectation that we will be seeing new legislation coming into effect about the age of retirement in Ireland.
Yes, you're right, exactly. So this is another piece of legislation that's been talked about for a number of years, but we are expecting to see it in the next couple of months. And what this legislation we expect to do will restrict an employer's ability to set a retirement age of under 66. So you probably agree, Kyle, I'd say a lot of companies would have a retirement age of 65 in their contracts, and that's just a very traditional retirement age. But when this piece of legislation comes in, it'll be a lot more difficult for companies to enforce a retirement age of 65. Now, having spoken to a lot of businesses and a lot of our Ibec members, we are seeing a general willingness, I think, for a lot of employers to allow an individual to stay on, maybe on a fixed-term contract of 1 year or 2 years post-retirement. So for a lot of companies, they may not see a huge change there. But it is just something to bear in mind that it'll be a lot more difficult for employers to enforce a retirement age of 65 once this legislation is passed, unless there is a safety critical aspect to the role or particular exceptional circumstances. That doesn't mean if an employee wants to retire at 65 that they can't. They will be allowed to retire at 65 if they want to do so. It'll just be harder for the employer to enforce it.
Remote working arrangements have been in place in most organisations for at least 5 years at this stage. But what type of questions does Ibec receive about remote working today?
Well, we're still getting an awful lot of questions around remote working, and probably they're still focusing really on the relatively recent legislation around the right to request remote working. So, and I think these misconceptions have been cleared up a little bit more in the more recent months. But I think when that legislation was initially passed, there was an expectation amongst certain employees that it gave a right to work remotely. But of course, we know that that was never the case. The right was a right to request remote working. So we're still probably seeing queries from our Ibec members about how to manage those requests. So we do know that employers have to allow their employees make a request if they so wish to work remotely, and then that the employer has to consider that request in line with their own obligations, the employee circumstances, and this code of practice, which gives us some more information around that, but that there isn't an obligation to actually accept a request to work remotely if it doesn't work for the organisation.
While many large tech companies are starting to impose a return to the office mandate on their employees, is this something that many of your members are pushing for, and indeed their employees are pushing back on?
We actually carried out a pulse survey in the last couple of weeks asking our members if they were planning on any significant changes to their remote or hybrid work arrangements. And actually the majority of employers said that they weren't. So I think probably maybe we are seeing more shifts around exactly how the hybrid work arrangement is set up. Maybe a focus on anchor days or having certain days where everybody gets together in the office. But I did think that survey was an interesting one, where really the majority of the respondents to that survey said that they weren't expecting any significant changes to their hybrid work policies at this point in time.
And talk to us about a recent Supreme Court decision regarding Domino's pizza delivery drivers and its potential implications for those businesses that use the services of contractors or indeed gig economy workers.
Yeah, you're right, Karl. That Supreme Court decision was really significant for those businesses who, like you say, engage self-employed individuals or independent contractors to do work for them. It set out a new test for how we determine whether an individual is an employee or an independent contractor. And without getting too much into the detail of that this morning, it's a Saturday morning after all, I think what I would probably say to companies is it certainly won't be enough for a company just to simply have a contract which states that the individual is an independent contractor. The courts and the revenue and the WRC will all look behind the contract and really look at the day-to-day reality of the relationship and will determine whether an individual is an employee or an independent contractor. And you'll look at things like the level of control, how intertwined into the business the individual is, and a number of factors like that. And I think only some companies might be a little bit surprised that if they applied these tests to some of their working arrangements, that more individuals might in fact be deemed to be employees than they might expect. There's been a couple of codes of practice published in the last year, and for any organisations who do have a cohort of independent contractors who work for them, I would encourage them to take a look at the Ibec website to get a little bit more guidance around whether those individuals are properly designated in their business or whether they might need to look at employment relationships for those individuals.
And as you look ahead, are there any other employment law changes coming down the track over the coming years?
I suppose there's a few for large organisations around European Works Councils. That's for the very large organisations in Ireland who might be impacted by those changes. We will be seeing some changes coming from the EU around platform workers, those online platform workers like you mentioned around the gig workers. And then, of course, the European AI Act will have an impact on employers in how they use AI in respect of the employment relationship. So it's an ever-changing space, Karl, probably, as you know yourself. So I would be encouraging employers to keep an eye on the Ibec website. Members of Ibec will receive HR Link, our newsletter, once a month, and that always has a really useful rundown of not only the upcoming legislation that's relevant to employers, but also the case law that we see, both from the Workplace Relations Commission, the Labour Court, and the Civil Courts. So it's a really good, it's some really good information in there for employers who are trying to keep up with the ever-changing employment landscape in Ireland.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Nichola Harkin, Head of Employment Law Services with Ibec, and I'd like to thank Nichola for sharing this information with us this morning. That brings us to the end of today's show, but before we go, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my production team, my guests for their contribution, and especially you as always for listening. Join me again next Saturday morning when we'll have more from the world of business. But until then, have a great week.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.